Good morning, students. Today we are going to discuss about the message-driven bean. It's a part of enterprise Java beans type. So in the previous class, we have discussed the session beans. So three types of beans we have seen. When to use the life cycle of the session bean, and simple example code we have seen. So the three types of session means like singleton, stateless and stateful session bean we have seen. Now we are going to discuss the message driven bean. So here in brief, message driven bean, when to use the message driven bean, then so how you can access a message driven bean, the life cycle of the MDB, and a example code we are going to discuss today now. So MDB represents a message driven bean. So what makes message driven beans different from session and entity beans? See, the difference is you cannot directly access the message driven bean like how you are accessing through the client interfaces to the session bean and the entity bean. So, the most visible difference between message driven beans and session bean and entity beans is that clients do not access MDB through interfaces. Through interfaces, you are not allowed to access the message driven beans. That makes the important difference between all the three beans. So, when to use message driven bean? Session beans and entity beans allow you to send JMS messages and to receive them synchronously but not asynchronously. In case of session bean or entity bean, so you are allowed to send a messages Java messaging service with the help of messaging services. You are allowed to send a messages, and you are allowed to receive the messages synchronously, one after the other. Whereas if you want to do the synchronous communication, you need to define the message driven bean. To avoid tying up server resources, you may prefer not to use blocking synchronous receives in a server-side component. See, to avoid tying up server resource means instead of giving up the control to the client request and responses, so to avoid those things, you may prefer not to use blocking synchronous receives in a server side component. So to receive messages asynchronously, use a message driven bean. Instead of give up the control to the clients request and responses, you can use the message driven bean to send or receive the messages asynchronously. Now let us look into the message driven bean in detail about the message driven bean. So MDB is designed for clients to invoke server-side business logic using asynchronous communication, which is a special case of a stateless session bean. How you can won't maintain the state between the client request and response rendered by the components of the server side. In the same way, you message driven beans also a stateless beans. So these are designed to invoke business logic using asynchronous communication. So to invoking the server side business logic, there is a different client side logic, server side logic, and the application logic. So to invoke the business logic, you are required to use the message driven bean. So note, there is not any home interface or remote interface for MDB. how you can define the local interface and the remote interface for accessing session beans and entity beans, but here it won't support those two interfaces because there is no direct interaction with the client to the server side. Okay, servers client interfaces are unable to access the server side logic. There is a special interface exists with the server side. So MDB monitors Java message service communications. So MDB, what MDB is going to do? It monitor the JMS Java message service communications and reacts to messages sent by the clients. So through the JMS and JPA, JMS API, this message driven bean communication which will happen through by the client. Clients don't directly access a MDB. Clients are not allowed to access the MDB because it is an internal logic. For example, let us take the example. Suppose if you want to save the content, means after withdraw some money from the bank, it needs to be calculated and finally it should be updated onto the database. So updating onto the database, that logical functions are hidden from the clients. The client can request for withdrawal of the transfer or the deposit the money. So internal functionalities and modules are hidden. So such kind of the functionality you can define using the message driven being because those functionalities are not able to access from the clients directly. Okay. So the MDB intercedes and processes requests anonymously. This is possible because MDB is stateless. So the stateless means won't maintain the state between the client request and the server response. So MDB intercedes internally. It is going to process